It also gets me into my next topic, which is a bit of the controversial one, and everyone's always talking about is the use of 0 days in cyber weapons and cyber attacks. And for me, I was in the past, I spent 11 years at Symantec working in patch management and doing basically helping patching, the 0 days once you got some type of configuration or hardening and so forth. And it also kind of got me in thinking as well as that when you're using a 0 day, you mentioned burning, if you want to be noisy and you have to do it fast, sometimes you have to burn something quickly. And it gets into is really what's the risks of 0 days, because 0 days, when we look at them, is that you could be, let's say what was a Windows vulnerability. If you look at the mass, how many people in the world are using Windows? And where's the mass population? Is your target mostly using those operating systems, or is it just that minute kind of, let's say, campaign target? And it gets into really kind of where do we sit, when is it okay to use 0 days, and when is it should be responsible disclosure, and when do we have to look at, when is the risk too high? When most of your citizens, let's say, for example, it was Facebook. Most of the citizens are, population using Facebook are, Western countries. And if it was a 0 day or some type of impact to use it against a target, at the same time, once that 0 days burned, it gives the target the ability to turn that around, weaponize it, and shoot it back again. It's unlike conventional kinetic weapons. It's like ping pong. Is when you hit the ball over to one side of the net, that ball can be turned around and hit right back at you. So what's your thoughts on the runs of 0 days, and when it gets into the responsible disclosure, the impact and risk assessments of when it's okay to use them?
Yeah, it's another really complicated topic. I think first off, if you are a legitimate offensive cyber actor, you should try as hard as possible not to have to use exploits. So you should lean on your unfair advantages as like a government agency to find other ways in. You know what I mean? And so maybe that's, the big one is credential stealing, right? So if you can just steal credentials and masquerade, like, do that, right? That's way less noisy. You aren't like compromising any kind of system at a fundamental level, and basically use the principle of like least the least invasive technique you can to achieve your objectives, right?
It's also avoiding the ethical, moral issues around disclosing that to the
exactly, right. And so I think generally speaking, that's the way to go. And I don't think that that's controversial. I think that definitely is how things go. Where you get into really sticky territory is like, okay, well, should we keep like a treasure chest of really critical vulnerabilities for like, if you're up against, an adversary who's got their shit together and like you can't masquerade, or they've got really stringent like controls around the things that you need to get into. Do you keep a sledgehammer around so that like if you've got to break into something, you do the risk reward calculus, and you're like, yeah, it's that important. Like let's use this O-Day, right? That's where we get into territory where not everyone's going to agree, right? And so where my feelings are is that I feel I love the way that the security community keeps us safe, right? And I love that we have responsible disclosure, and we've changed the mentality so that manufacturers and people that publish software no longer have a litigious response to you like disclosing something. It's like, oh, thank you for doing that. Here's some money. I think we've come a really long way. And my default position is like, disclose the vulnerability, keep us safe, right? Because if you talk to a government, someone who's lived in the government their whole life and all they know is cyber operations, they're going to be focused on their little view of the world, and they're going to say, no, like that RC against Windows remote desktop is like super juicy, like we need that, we'll pay for that, and like keep it on the side, please don't disclose that, because that means a lot to them in their operations. But you think about the millions of people that are now all of a sudden at risk, right? Because maybe they live under a dictatorship, or there's they're a journalist and they're getting suppressed, right? Like is the juice worth the squeeze there? Like, I don't know. I kind of go back and forth on it because I've seen both sides. You know what I mean? I don't really have any good answers.
What you're saying is the same people who have no problem keeping a nuclear arsenal around also fall. I mean, it's the same sort of thing of we have this like deterrent sledgehammer thing that we all know is completely, we should never use, but yet we don't want to get rid of it.
Right.
And so it puts, right. I'm sure if it was up to civilians, 100% up to civilians, we'd probably be doing something different than what we do.
Yeah. I mean, the additional, so I was just going to say the additional complexity there is that I think making a nuclear weapon that you can put on an ICBM is orders of magnitude harder than finding some of these vulnerabilities. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's like,
I think it's important. It's the capability. I think you don't need to store thousands of these things around. It's the capability. Knowing that you have the capability of doing it is sometimes enough of a deterrent. And knowing that you have, the capability, if you needed to, you could have, hundreds of them in a short amount of time. I think it's more the capability versus, having it sitting around, because having it sitting around just means that you have to maintain aging, let's say very unstable, very, rusting, maintaining a very costly infrastructure to do so. I think it's more as knowing that you have the ability to produce something quickly is enough of a deterrent. And those, when you get into really big kinetic impact side of things.
I think that also goes with what Josh was saying earlier about like use your unfair advantage, right? As a nation state, I imagine if we really needed to find a 0-day quickly, there's no reason to stockpile them. We probably could find it pretty quick.
Or find another way in, use human enabled operations, right? Like we're a government, we can pay people off to do stuff. You know what I mean? Like there are other ways around it, and I just go back to, we've seen a couple of really devastating worms, in the past couple of years that, ostensibly came from a compromised like nation state actor. You think about Eternal Blue, that remote code execution vulnerability. Like having that on the shelf would be really, I imagine, for whoever the agent was that got compromised from it, having that on the shelf is incredibly valuable. Like if you've got to crack into a hard target and there's no other way, you've got to get into that domain controller, or you've got to get into like the IT administrator's like workstation or whatever, and you've been sitting there for 3 months and there's like some critical stuff going on. Like, bring out the hammer. Like we got to get in there. I can see how the temptation is there, but like, look at the damage, right? Was the juice worth the squeeze on that? I don't know. That's not for me to say, but
several trillion in companies' value over a space of only a few months. This is where I look at is that at some point in time, you have to let go of things that are from the past. You have to keep moving forward, and those types of sitting on the shelf. We should have a shelf life for them. I think it should also be based on a risk assessment approach, saying that, this particular exploit or a 0-day, that it can, there's an 80-20 rule that this 80-20 of my own was that people that I'm protecting are exposed to this and only 20% of my target. When do you have that decision of, okay, there's a shelf life of this. I prefer not to, nobody but us. How do you know that no one else has it until it's been used? Which is the
Well, the longer it sits around, the more likely it is that somebody else has discovered it anyway.
Exactly.
So it's probably better to
correct. So there should be an expiration or shelf life of those, and you should always be looking for the next one, the one that you find next, and keep moving forward, especially on later versions and updated. And this even gets me into one. I remember there was a situation a few years ago. I was in DC, and it was all about private companies doing this for a business and selling it to governments. And this is where my ethical moral compass gets, I hate that ability where a private company, their business model is for finding 0 days and selling them to governments, because they're not going to sell to one government, they're going to sell to many. And overnight, some of those, governments that they sell it to could turn to be a foe. So where is it okay for private companies to be in kind of involved in this type of activity? They be classified as export compliance, because there's a lot of companies and there is no export compliance for these types of activities. For a 0-day, there is no export compliance.
It's complicated. Look, private companies are are motivated by profit, right? And that's neither good nor bad. It really depends on what the company's, doing. And I mean, I think we're seeing things like, the 0-day initiative and bug bounties are starting to get us towards a place where people who do this kind of work of reverse engineering and vulnerability research can make a really good living, like exposing vulnerabilities and getting them patched. It pales in comparison to certain kinds of, like if you have a full-blown jailbreak for an iPhone from Safari mobile browser all the way through to the kernel, like it's like, over $1 million, right? Is probably what a government would be willing to pay for that. I am unaware of any private company. I don't know what Apple would pay you for that, but I'm pretty sure it's not over $1 million.
Less than 100. I think their maximum has been 10, 25, or even 50K. So it really becomes where it becomes a private government, kind of type of customer, and the thing is that those companies, they want to sell to they don't just want one customer, they want to have multiple. So that's where you get into the challenge.
Right. Why like sell it to Apple and 3 government agencies, 3 other governments?
Well, for me, that's actually perfectly fine because it gives you equal race. It's an equal playing field that everyone has the same starting point. If they sold it at the same time, that is.
Right.
It gives everyone an equal opportunity. For me, I'm perfectly fine where that's a disclosure, meaning that, I'm racing to find a fix and to patch it, and others are racing to exploit it. So it gives an equal opportunity. And that's what responsible disclosure sometimes is about, is to give everyone the equal opportunity rather than having attackers having knowledge and using it, abusing it before everyone can actually go to harden or to decide and do a risk approach. And it gets into
the responsible disclosure is making, my opinion is that you're trying to give the defender a little bit of a leg up. You don't like release it all at the same time. You say, hey, this is a thing. I want you, I wanted you to be aware of it. And if they don't take care of it within a reasonable period of time, then you do to force the hand, but you want to give them at least, some period of time to address it.
Absolutely. Now that's the 90-day rule where they really give, notifying the vendor first and giving them the opportunity to fix it. But at the same day, when it gets into what we're talking about is selling it to governments, I think it's important to give everyone an equal playing field at that point.
Right.
And I guess should we end up getting into where should we have actually for security researchers, should they get some type of protection, like a whistleblower type of protection for this as well? Because I remember doing a panel a couple of years ago, and it was an interesting panel because we had security researchers, pen testers on one side, we had law enforcement on another, and companies on another. And the outcome scenario was interesting because law enforcement said, if you basically, let's say, find an exploit or find some type of vulnerability in those companies, either infrastructure or tools or solution, whatever it may be, and you do it in a way that you might be exposing yourself to some legal issues, then the law enforcement says, disclose it anonymously. And then the other side is, so your hard work, you never get recognized for. And then the second part is that if those companies find out that you did find a vulnerability and that they're potentially putting many customers and companies and people and citizens at risk by actually not fixing it, that they will end up suing the security researchers for actually doing that activity. And it gets into, and there's a lot of cases right now, there's several companies that are actually suing security researchers and even journalists for reporting it, that to really make it move forward should be some type of protection over those who are not doing it from a criminal perspective. They're not profiting over it. And it's more about getting to that equal playing field where we all have the ability to know about it and decide ourselves to fix it. So Joshua, do you have any thoughts on that, and Mike as well?
Yeah, definitely. So it's certainly like a scary thing, right? I worked a little bit with the EFF's Coders' Rights Initiative. These guys are amazing. They give pro bono legal advice to people that like disclose vulnerabilities. So I've worked with them a couple of times on some things, and that's given me a lot of comfort that I was on like firm legal footing and like disclosing vulnerabilities, especially like One of them, I found a vulnerability in the DNC's donor database. Like you could dump their entire donor list. You could like unsubscribe people. It was pretty horrible. It's like a URL enumeration thing. And, you know, obviously given their history, I was like really concerned about like what's going to happen if I like disclose this thing. So I think number one is just like having resources available for security researchers that are doing good work to make sure that they feel like they're on firm legal footing when they go and approach people. But then of course, you know, those lawyers are giving legal advice about US code. And so like we need to make sure that US code is also, you know, unambiguously and firmly like outlining what is and is not, you know, because another part of it is, especially when you're dealing with, I mean, if you're dealing with, you know, a binary or some code that you have in like a mocked up environment, that's one thing. Oftentimes when you're dealing with like SaaS vulnerabilities, you're dealing with a live server that's in production. And so like when you're in the process of discovering what's going on with that service, there's always in the back of your mind, like, where is the line? Like, where's the line here where like, I'm good. And then, oh, wow, okay, I found like, you know, a SQL injection and now I just dumped a bunch of customer data. Like, is this the line? Like, where's the line, you know? And so like, I think we need to go a longer way and like illuminating that for people. And the challenge is that it's really hard to explain this stuff to people that are experts in crafting code. So like, you know, I don't know what the way forward is there. But yeah, Mike, I'd love to hear, you know, what your thoughts are.
Yeah, no, it's just a tough issue, right? And I mean, my thoughts are all over. But yeah, I think about our own disclosure program that we've released and, you know, my thoughts on, yeah, I do want people to participate. I want to know those vulnerabilities. And to your point of like, well, what's too far? We were actually having this discussion the other day about like, well, so we have a platform and people can launch, you know, virtual machines and do, you know, labs and all these things. Well, that actually runs up our bill. So at what point of doing like, I appreciate you letting me know, but I also don't want you to like cause our AWS bill or our vendor bill to go and, you know, and put us out of business because you didn't realize the impact of this thing that you're doing to test. And so I think there's a lot of, it's a difficult area.
Yeah. And if your point is that sometimes it only makes an incident when there's actually some type of financial impact as well. So that when there is some financial, you know, money, and I go back to the cuckoo's egg, which I always love reading the book, and there's, you know, I think it was a 73 or 77 cents, which actually became the criminal activity,
right?
Even though it was such a minute cost. And it gets into, so Josh, you were saying one of the things I find, I remember doing, you know, a lot of penetration tests in the past where I could walk up to the door and the door's open. I could look through the door. I could stand there. I could watch people coming in the door. But the moment I put my foot inside the door, that's when that gray legal area became the challenge. And that's where you can sit and watch whatever data is going in and out. You could, you know, the door's lying right open, and other, you know, let's say criminals could decide to go in through that same door. But when the point is that you want to know, well, what's the risk of that door being opened? What's behind it? And end up getting in. You'll start looking, and now it's a database,
right?
And then you've got all the sensitive data. So now you know the risk, but at that point in time, to identify the risk, you put your foot in the door, and right. This is where it always gets in. And so the EFF, I think, is definitely fantastic to have that, at least from a legal backing for a lot of security researchers. But I do think there needs to be some type of at least protection from a whistleblower type of scenario, security whistleblowing scenario protection for the future to make sure that they're not exposed, because you know a lot of these are individuals. You know, most hackers are good citizens looking to use their skill and help. And right. Sure, they're not hiding,
especially if they're telling you about it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And even work with them to help fix it, because sometimes they're the ones that knows how to
right.
close the door.
So, and I think one of the other challenges is that the sort of international, right? So the U.S. laws, and if what happens if the researcher's in some other country or vice yep. versa, we're here. So I think there's probably got to be some sort of international framework. And, earlier you were mentioning the whole, sell it to nations and multiple nations. like what ran through my head is like, do we need like a WHO of, World Health Organization of cybersecurity, where it's actually a UN run, and like they'll give you $10 million. They can put up more money than anyone else for that vulnerability and make sure that there is that even playing field.
Right.
Something along those lines.
And this gets into what I mentioned earlier about things like the Talon Papers, which was one of those first steps, really looking at international cooperation and really kind of, that definition into how we actually mitigate, these types of incidents in the future. And then I really like when Brad Smith, Microsoft, really kind of brought up the term. I was a bit against it at the beginning because I wasn't quite sure what his opinion, what the Geneva Convention style type of cyber cooperation, which is really, that WHO of the cyber realm, right, about, how do you make sure that if somebody does decide to do a cyber warfare, attack against a nation state, to make sure that civilians are avoided. And it gets into the big gray areas, even in Ukraine, when you attack a power station, you take out electricity. Was there human life losses? Because, I worked in ambulance services and hospitals in the past, and if I have no electricity, especially for, in a December winter night, and when it's really cold, then you are at risk of, people's lives being lost. So, this gets into really where I think after those events and those areas that I do think there has to be some protection, but because, sometimes even Josh, you mentioned, is that civilians working in aircraft carriers, civilians working in, war zones and military locations, that, to make sure that they're not at risk. So we do need to have some, especially things like Red Cross is out in a lot of these areas for medical scenarios, but we really do need to have some type of Geneva Convention to protect civilians from being secondary victims of accidental cyber attacks.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I think this is totally not a plug for Shift 5, I promise. But I think we've seen a ton of security activity in the information technology space over the past couple of decades. Obviously, we've seen a lot of really promising work in defending these systems, to the point now where, like, you and I, do banking transactions on the internet, and we're more or less reasonably confident that it's secure against the casual attacker, at least. That's pretty incredible progress, right? But if you look at like operational technology, so things like planes, trains, automobiles, your car, I'm sure this isn't news to you guys, but like your car has dozens of computers in it, like microcontrollers that are running firmware, communicating with each other. And like on a lot of cars these days, when you move the steering wheel, it's not like directly driving the wheels. It's like fly by wire. Like there are computers in the middle of you and your wheels. So there's software that is conveying you on a highway, like at 75 miles an hour or whatever, right? Like that's kind of terrifying, because I will tell you, after looking at these systems, they are nowhere near the level of security that IT systems are, and that is terrifying. You know what I mean? Like there's not an OT system that I've seen or come across or been part of a team that's done penetration tests where we just haven't compromised it at the lowest level. These things are designed with physical security in mind, and that's just completely not the case anymore. Either A, you can very readily gain physical access to these things, or the supply chain that is putting these systems together, or B, like very often there's telemetry systems nowadays in your car. You got your OnStar, and like, I think GM, for example, like not to call them out, but they have like every car as of 2017 or 2018 has like, you have no option in the matter. Like it is going to phone home. You know what I mean? And so like, I think on the IT side, we've seen that that information systems can cause loss of human life. Like there was a hospital, I can't recall where it was, but like, I think NotPetya hit them and like crypto lockered a bunch of systems, and they couldn't like schedule surgeries. And like, there was like patient management issues that like undoubtedly cost loss of life. Right. Now imagine we do that to OT systems, which like the whole point of these systems is to manipulate the physical world. Like it's too easy for us to like go to, the DC Metro and run a train into the blocks at 80 miles an hour. Right. I mean, I don't know. That's where I'm just like absolutely terrified is that we haven't made progress on the OT side.
I agree. That's probably one of the areas that keeps me up at night is that the where it comes into where people's lives are at risk, and that was always to get into when I worked in ambulance service years ago, my systems, I had an SLA of 23 minutes, and if my systems weren't running for 23 minutes, then I knew I was responsible for people's lives, and that's where your SLA, and that's where nearly but from then till now, that's the only thing I remember in my entire career that really give me a lot of pressure and actually kept me up at night, where I want to make sure that those systems were operating all the time. And your point as well is that when you're buying equipment today, if you're buying a TV or a car or whatever, but they call it IoT devices, but really it's just a computer that is dedicated purpose kind of use functional, that cannot be reprogrammed that much. It's dedicated purpose. And when you buy them, you're actually not buying the car. You're renting the service of the car, and it's the manufacturer vendor who's now owning the data. I remember even I did a project on autonomous shipping, and the engines that we were using for the autonomous ship that we didn't own. We purchased the engines, we owned the hardware itself, but the manufacturer owned the data that those engines were actually creating. So it gets into even the cars. You get a Tesla. It's the manufacturer owns the data that those cars create. And there's a lot of those difference in contracts that we have today, which even increases a lot of risks that, and it's ease of use, it's simplicity. I remember somebody, one's like, they had this computer system, and it was a funny scenario. It was that the computer system, this is the most secure computer system ever, everything, you can't access it, it's very limited. And the person came up and turned around, and one of the guys in the team said, "Oh, so if I take the chassis off, the alarms and stuff will go off, and I can't interfere with the computer electrical equipment." And they're like, "Absolutely." He took a drill and drilled a hole in the top of the computer, took the top off, and of course, not setting off any alarms, and then had direct access to electrical equipment. So, sometimes it gets into perception, and we have to make sure that we are realistically, when we're looking at these from a security perspective, is doing a proper assessment and proper risk assessment. And that should be part of, security by design. And it will definitely help, in the future, become more resilient. And this ultimately, the more resilient you are, the more less attractive you are to cyber attacks. And that goes back to even Estonia, as I mentioned at the beginning, when Estonia decentralizes data repositories across multiple countries, they became less attractive because in order to attack Estonia, you needed to attack 5 countries. And that becomes a less attractive. And for an attacker, you might be attacking your ally as a result of that, because you might have good relations. And it also means that those small countries are almost acting like a bigger country because they're cooperating, collaborating, and relying on those other countries' infrastructures. So I think that really kind of gets into one of my next points and final points is the defensive side of things, where civilians get involved. And I know the article that you wrote was actually heavily, getting into this area, where even Estonia, after the attack, there was the development of what's called as a cyber defense league. And this is really where I like is where civilians get involved to defending the country and leaving the offensive capabilities to the government, offensive operations. So what do you think, especially in countries around the world and even in the US, the future of cyber defenses, or, a cyber core, or whatever we call it, or cyber reserves, or, the guards? What do you think it is today, and where do you think it needs to go in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of really promising progress on this front. So, there are a number of initiatives at the National Security Agency and at Cyber Command to share. I mean, there are details to work out here, but information sharing between corporations and the U.S. government, I think we're building some strong foundations there, and that is absolutely critical. I think corporations need to trust the government that, like, if we're tipping them off to something that we're seeing at the government level using our unfair advantages, that they trust that information, right? So, that's going to be a long-term relationship building thing. There's a technology solution as well as a people solution that we need to build in there. So that, I think, is a really important foundation. I think we're seeing also promising progress on the civil-military divide. We need to go farther, but I think, for example, National Guards are standing up these cyber units that can go and do incident responses as appropriate. And these are people that, their day job, they're a CISO at a company, or they work in a SOC or something like that. And then they can transition that experience directly into their military role and go do an incident response on a power plant or something like that. So seeing a lot of really promising progress there. And then, on the government side, we're still having a hard time, attracting, not even attracting, but retaining really talented individuals and keeping them satiated with a high stream of quality work. They signed up to do a mission, and oftentimes most of the time they're not doing that mission. They're doing military ceremonial stuff rather than, digging into an incident or something, and giving them the tools. I think it's a pretty hot sell to be able to say someone, hey, you're going to go do hunt missions on submarines that are deployed, or you're going to go out to, Afghanistan, and you're going to do hunt missions on helicopters. You know what I mean? You're going to take, when the helicopters come back, you're going to go and you're going to dissect all kinds of memory dumps and do hunting and surveillance and analysis. You could attract some top talent to do that kind of mission, but we throw up a lot of barriers to getting them there. I'm a lot more confident though on the defensive side, because I think the people can do the defensive mission in their civilian capacities in a lot of ways, where on the offensive side, the closest analog you have is pen testing or threat emulation. And guess where a lot of those threat emulators come from? They were my coworkers until they got fed up with government service, and then they go and they write rootkits for whoever, right? So yeah, kind of a scatter shot, but I'm relatively pretty bullish on where we're headed, especially on the defensive side. I see a lot of promising progress.
And that's great to hear, because I think over the years I've been seeing a lot of different, discussions at points, and I think over the years I've been sharing what Estonia's been doing in those areas, and hopefully that it's been replicated and those lessons learned, what the cyber defenses, and then even here that we have the Lock Shields event every year, which does the more government type of let's say gamification side of things. So it also gets into a lot of the active side of things. So that's always great to see. And I think those types of engagements and activities will definitely increase, both the defensive and offensive capabilities over the long term. So there's a lot of positives, I think, direction on this. And I think, overall the direction, I think there was a lot of scary areas, of course, in the OT side and the 0 days and, protection and stuff. But I think I'm glad that I haven't seen anything major in the last couple of years. And I guess reading the latest Sandworm, that it's meant to be a 10-year thing, a 10-year thing. So maybe we're due one sometime soon. So we should be on our toes, because definitely being in Estonia, we have a noisy neighbor that keeps us, let's say, vigorous and, not complacent. We're always kind of observant and alert. And so it's always, making sure that you don't become complacent over time. I think that's important as well.
Yeah, for sure.
So awesome. I think this has been interesting. I think the audience is going to have a lot of different things to take away from this, a lot of different discussions, and for sure we could probably go on for each topic for hours and hours.
Oh, no doubt.
So, but Josh, fantastic having you on the show. It's amazing. I think definitely I'd love to even pick one of these topics, or even one of the events, and
anytime.
Even go into a lot more discussion and looking at details.
Would absolutely
Mike, again, yeah, Mike, awesome having, was it even from your side, even was it your observations on what Cybrary is doing in regards to things like bounties and activities around responsible disclosure? So I think maybe we got 2 or 3 shows out of this one. I don't know. So, but it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show, for everyone, and really look forward to follow-ups in the future.
Great. Looking forward to it. Thanks so much, Justin. It's great to meet you. Good to see you, Mike.